Welcome to News from Neptune for February 22nd in the 8th week of 2019. I'm Carl Estabrook. Our program is conceived in the spirit of Rosa Luxemburg, murdered by a social democratic government a century ago, who said the most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. That begins by calling things by the right name, particularly in regard to socialism and capitalism. Our mentor, Noam Chomsky, has said, terms like capitalism and socialism have been so evacuated of meaning that I don't like to use them. There's nothing remotely like capitalism in existence. To the extent there ever was, it disappeared by the 1920s. Every industrial society today is one form or another of state capitalism. That doesn't deny that state capitalist regimes that called themselves socialists made immense strides in the 20th century, in Russia and China notably. Since the last decade of that century, our program has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, done in the spirit of Noam Chomsky. First on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Chomsky says in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. David Green and I will try to say some true things in this era of neoliberalism, or corporate globalism, if you prefer, or, to borrow a phrase, capitalism with American characteristics. We were reminded this week by the duplicitous FBI man, Andrew McCabe, the U.S. political establishment very much wants you to oppose Trump's administration, for fear he, Trump, might interfere with the military and economic policies of recent administrations, as he threatened to do, without much result, since the 2016 election campaign. It would be far better to work against those government policies, practiced by all recent U.S. administrations, that promise more war and more inequality. In his remarkable 1973 novel, Gravity's Rainbow, Thomas Pynchon offers this as one among his proverbs for paranoids. If they can get you asking the wrong questions, they don't have to worry about answers. How can we reverse the 2016 election is a wrong question. Better questions than the purposeful distraction of how do we get Trump out are A, how do we reverse the murderous foreign policy, neoconservatism, of the United States, and B, how do we reverse the criminal economic policy, neoliberalism, of the United States. Most people should oppose the duopoly, the administrative rule by Republicans and Democrats, because it does not serve the interests of the majority at home or abroad, but rather the opposed interests of the American elite, the less than 1%. The American ruling class must ensure that dismay among the majority at U.S. multiple wars around the world and increasing and accelerating inequality at home can be contained and does not get out of hand. The present scheme is to divert the dismay to Trump, but their desperation is shown by the fantastical nature of that diversion. Russiagate, for which they've enlisted the aid of the elite-dominated mainstream media to an extent that I would not have thought possible. What is happening is many Americans are seeing their standard of living and their life chances being confiscated by 40 years of neoliberal policies. After increasing throughout the 30 glorious years, 1945 to 1975, wages in the U.S. have been flat since the 1970s. For many, saying "Make America Great Again" means restore the opportunities for jobs and income my parents had. This is not an accident, but the result of conscious choices by every U.S. administration, beginning with Jimmy Carter's. It's the basis for the populist upsurge that produced Sanders and Trump. The populist vision has been described as a view that, quote, pits a virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice, close quote. That's what people who take this view see. That's what the people who elected Donald Trump see. The growth of this view is not limited to the U.S. It has also produced Brexit in Britain, the Yellow Vests in France, the coalition government in Italy, and similar events across the capitalist world. The elites recognize it and fear it, and move heaven and earth through their control of the media to convince the bien-pensants that it's all a matter of racism. It's not. What's on your agenda, David?
Well, to segue smoothly into a couple of things I've made note of, Karl Marx, a famous guy, wrote a book called The German Ideology in 1845. And one of the famous quotes from that book is something I don't know that we've ever read on this program, but it probably bears reading, especially in relationship to what you just said. The ideas, quote, the ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas, i.e. the class which is the ruling material force of society as it is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships. The dominant material relationships grasped as ideas. Hence, of the relationships which make the one class the ruling one, therefore the ideas of its dominance. And from there, I'm going to go into a tirade about identity politics on many fronts. The first of which is from a philosopher at DePaul, or I think an emeritus philosopher at DePaul up in Chicago, who's been writing way too long articles in Counterpunch, which say a lot of true things and resonate with me if I can ever get through them. His name is Bill Martin, and this most recent one, this past Wednesday, February 20th, was called The Fourth Hypothesis, the Present Juncture of the Trump Clarification and the Watershed Moment on the Washington Mall. And one of the primary quotes that I grabbed from this is in relation to the Washington Mall, which happened before our last program, which we didn't mention, and because we usually don't talk about stuff like that because they're seen as sort of media spectacles. But I think in a larger context, it's important what happened on the Washington Mall. Not so much what happened, but what was made of what happened.
Exactly.
And what Bill Martin writes is that the horrible attacks on a smiling male teenager, Nicholas Sandmann, speak to the essence of the left now, that it has no ideas, that it has subordinated itself completely to anti-universalist and anti-working class identity politics, that its methods, quote unquote, are snark, name-calling, the crude neo-positivism of throwing out a quote unquote fact or two, joined with the inability to analyze or even read, arrogant and superior attitudes towards quote-unquote ordinary people, creating or / falling for stunts, doubling down on judgments that were ridiculous to begin with, and now simply nothing more than pure self-righteous hatred and the accompanying vitriol. That's one aspect of identity politics which he lays out in this article, which unfortunately is over 20,000 words long, if you can believe that.
Short novel.
Probably the longest article ever on Counterpunch, much of which is not all that comprehensible, but I like his main idea, and that is that Trump, the election of Donald Trump signified cracks in the ruling class, cracks among the ruling class, and rebellion of a certain portion of the population against the ruling ideas of our era. Some of them having to do with, say, globalization and quote unquote free trade, and others having to do with war, as you and both of us are always saying on this program. So that's one. Let me just take on a local example of this.
Okay.
There's an upcoming event next month, Saturday, March 23rd, from 3 to 5 p.m. at the Urbana Free Library. That's been organized by a local woman named Nina Paley. Nina Paley is known to many in this area as many things: an animator, a filmmaker, and the daughter of a former Urbana mayor, a man named Hiram Paley, who was a math professor at the U of I. The topic of this panel that she's organized for the afternoon of Saturday, March 23rd, is "Does Sex Matter? Gender Identity versus Material Reality." Nina Paley, you can look at her blog, ninapaley.com, Paley, and you can find out that she has been under attack. She has been, as we like to say, deplatformed for questioning some of the tenets of trans rights, of the rights of people who define themselves as transsexual. And so let me just read this little blurb, and I will return to this since it's another 4 weeks before this is going to happen. She's a very funny person, a very clever person, and she is known for two animated films. Sita Sings the Blues, which was, I think, shown at the Ebert Festival a year or two back, and a current film that she has called Sadomasochism. The word Seder is spelled S-E-D-E-R. And of a woman of Jewish background, she is an anti-copyrightist, and she puts her movies on the web for free, so you could watch Sadomasochism, which is an animated book also, she has organized this panel. Quote, "A trans woman, a detransitioner, and a radical feminist walk into a library. Speaking from different perspectives on modern gender identity politics, these three panelists agree that all people broadly deserve civil rights protections. But should gender identity replace sex as a legal category? Women, particularly marginalized, imprisoned, lesbian, and abused women, pay the highest price for this trend, as sex-based protections and resources are rolled back in the name of inclusivity. Despite their unwavering support for individual expression, each speaker has faced repercussions for critically analyzing gender identity, including threats of violence, professional blacklisting, and loss of friendships. They joined for this event in the hope that it will encourage wider civil and respectful discussion. No lives will be harmed or erased while exploring these topics." And so among the panelists, the three panelists will be Nina Paley herself, a woman who is identified as an adult transsexual from Indianapolis, and a woman who is a woman who is identified as a detransitioned woman and family therapist. So I only raise this because it's a local issue. It is I think a good example of how identity politics has operated, as Bill Martin refers to, in the kind of nastiest sense of the word, in terms of deplatforming. If one goes on Nina Paley's website, one will find out that one of the people that she has been deplatformed by is none other than the head of the Gender and Sexuality Studies program here at the U of I, a woman named Mimi Nguyen. So there's a lot of grist for the mill, and we may even be reading about this in the News Gazette, which has a curious relationship with the U of I in terms of radicalism, so-called radicalism, and sort of boosterism. But it says here that the moderator of this panel is going to be Tracy Nally, Executive Vice President and General Counsel of News Gazette Media, For over 30 years, she has worked in the areas of defamation, access to public records and meetings, protection of reporters' news gathering privileges, and other First Amendment and free speech related matters. So that's identity politics for now.
I think there are 2 points here, David, one general and one particular that relates to the sorts of things we talk about frequently on this program. One is the notion of identity politics itself and its, how shall I put it, checkered history. Identity politics, at its heart, seems to me, and I've argued this here before, I think you agree, an attempt by American liberalism to gather the scraps of its reputation and wrap itself in those scraps after it had given up the thing that American liberalism had been concerned with for most of the 20th century, that is exploitation. What the New Deal was about, Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, was to blunt the edge of exploitative capitalism because of the immense suffering brought about by the Great Depression. The problem was that this tradition, a tradition of trying to maintain capitalism by taking the edges off it, so to speak, this tradition came apart after the Vietnam War, and American capitalists reasserted capitalism in a particularly vigorous fashion, the fashion that came to be known as neoliberalism, the rule of money, the free market, free market fundamentalism, it was called, and so forth. American liberals saw this happening in the 70s. They looked around and said, well, okay, if we can't do what we've done all along, which was try to ameliorate capitalism a bit, maybe there's something else we could do that make us feel good about being on the left, so to speak. Let's deal with people who are discriminated against, notably blacks. The civil rights movement has given them a community that they said, okay, we'll step up for you. Well, quite a different thing was going on in the civil rights movement, represented by Martin Luther King's notion that the only way the civil rights movement would ever succeed is that economic supports for all people in the society should be in place, that only socialism would finally fulfill the demands of the civil rights movement. What American liberalism did was not follow King, not take that point seriously at all, but rather look around for other discriminated against groups, substituting discrimination for exploitation as their concern. Now, the interesting thing about this is that in the next 40 years, from the 1970s to today, what happened is the discriminated groups exfoliated. They grew and multiplied and so forth in difficult ways. And no place more obviously than in matters of gender, sex and gender. It produced something that I think might be called angelism. Angelism is the view that a human being is what he decides, or she, or he, or they, whatever you prefer. One's identity depends upon one's decision, the way sort of angels were depicted in medieval theology. Material reality doesn't apply. If you want to say that you are a 10-year-old girl trapped in the body of a 70-year-old man, that's perfectly acceptable. I'm referring
What a
to
great example.
Well, I'm referring. It's actually a real example that occurred in Britain. And produced quite an argument a while ago. This was dug out by some research of our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, and I will post Jeff's comments on this on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. But in any case, once you assume that your identity is plastic, that you can be what you want, that you are not limited by any material reality, rather different from the views of the old man in the British Museum that you were quoting earlier in the program. But once you decide that, then you are off and running to take up your discrimination and complain about it. This seems to me to be a council of despair. This is identity politics as a dead end, particularly when this identity politics is substituted for the real politics, the economic politics, the old liberal politics that was set aside in an age of neoliberalism. This is a serious problem, and it is taken particularly as the banner of the Democratic Party right now, and some of the few people who are actually pointing this out and contrasting this enthusiasm for identity politics with the Democratic Party's tradition of opposition to exploitation. One of the few people actually commenting on that in mainstream media is remarkably enough, Tucker Carlson. Now, Tucker has some funny ideas himself, and they get confused with the sorts of things he's talking about, but he makes this point.
Yeah.
What are we going to do when that's what the situation is?
In the last day or two, a video came up of something that he recorded but apparently wasn't aired on Fox News.
Right.
And it was seen as a slam dunk against Tucker Carlson, when in fact this fellow who came on his program to talk about taxing the rich,
right,
and he was heard completely politely and civilly and asked appropriate questions and responses by Tucker Carlson, then turned against Tucker Carlson and said, well, you're a millionaire.
Right.
You know what? You're running this. You're part of this. And basically announcing, I'm on this program to not for you to attack me, but for me to attack you. And this was seen on the identity politics left as a slam dunk against Tucker Carlson.
Yeah, yeah.
It's just unbelievable how people are supposed to interpret this video.
I did watch it.
Am I right in saying that? Do you think
it's not quite? I would say that no.
Okay, I'm wrong. Okay.
I think that.
I didn't watch it. I just read the subtitle.
Yeah.
I mean, I read the subtitles. I didn't hear it.
Right.
Okay.
The interlocutor was a clever Dutch economist,
right,
talking about the worldwide economic meeting at Davos, and in the course of that, he said what you just said, that Tucker Carlson himself was essentially a front man for the billionaires who run the world. And as you say, the Dutch economist said to Tucker Carlson, look, you're on the media, you're a millionaire, and you're finally giving cover to billionaires. Well, Tucker Carlson was offended and said so in language that they felt they couldn't run on the air. But the Dutch economist was right, of course.
Of course.
And Tucker Carlson had some case in the sense that he was broadcasting the Dutch economist's views, and they became an attack on him, perfectly legitimately perhaps, but not one he was quite ready to take on. Yeah. So it pointed up the problem. I don't think it was as pellucid as most people thought it was. Carlson, who had precisely been talking about the Democratic Party's mobilization of identity politics, the Democratic Party's attempt to say that the problems are racism and that is what has to be attacked, and not the problem of the declining life chances of most Americans, was nonplussed by this by this attack, and I think properly didn't run it because he was not prepared to give the answer that he might have given. Mm-hmm. So it was a bit confusing, in part because the Dutch economist was so clever.
Yeah. Like I'm saying,
right.
I mean, not the slam dunk of shaming Tucker Carlson to the extent that it was presented on the platforms in which I heard about this.
He was exactly, and the Dutchman was right. So it was that made it all the more difficult for poor Tucker.
Yeah. Stephen Saleta came up in the news this past week, or came up at least online doing some writing, and I was prompted to find a quote from him that he had in his book Israel's Dead Soul.
Oh, yes.
And it relates to this issue. Little out of context, but see if this works.
Okay.
He said, in a broader sense, and this has to do with the whole issue of multicultural. He was not as well known as a critic of many of the aspects of university identity politics, intersectionality, multiculturalism, the whole thing. But he really was in the context of his advocacy for Palestine. And what he said, from an academic perspective, is, in a broader sense, we need to complicate the perception that diversity and multiculturalism are intuitively valuable phenomena. Their practice is problematic. Diversity and multiculturalism, their practice is problematic because it is manifestly exclusionary. Multiculturalism is a propitious element, and he's criticizing, at this point in time, Cornel West and Michael Eric Dyson, the latter of which, of course, deserves to be harshly criticized. Cornel West comes and goes. Anyway, multiculturalism is a propitious element of West and Dyson's market niche, not an object of their critical attention. Okay, that may be a little academic, but it was typical of the fact that Stephen Salaita, ironically, found himself, when the News Gazette and Jim Dye continues to go after him in various ways, subtle and unsubtle. Stephen Salaita was really, ironically, on their side in questioning a lot of the multicultural and diversity and intersectional pieties that we find in academia these days, especially on this campus. And just one more thing before I forget to say it. Basically, what Nina Paley reduced her argument to, and what she feels like she's gotten into so much trouble for, is asserting that men are humans who have penises. That's really what it amounts to. This is what she says. This is what she feels is obvious. And this is the basis of her challenge to the manner in which transsexualism is being treated right now. And this is what's gotten her into so much trouble. And a sort of a straightforward, factual, biological statement.
And I had here a moment ago the comment by Martina Navratilova that she was talking about, let me see if I can find it. The specific issue here is what's been called TERFism, trans-exclusionary,
yes,
radical
feminism. That's exactly what Nina Paley has been
called. Which Nina Paley is in the terms of the discussion that we've been using. The present form of the contretemps has arisen from some comments that the famous tennis player Martina Navratilova made some time ago about the identification of, there we go, trans women as athletes. That is, people who are biologically male but have identified as, or even surgically established themselves as female, and their involvement in Navratilova's life work, that is, professional sports. And she was criticized heavily for saying the things that she did, attacking people of that sort, and she retired, as it were, from the fray for a little while, saying that she would examine the question a little more closely. Then she writes, well, I've now done this is Martina Navratilova. I've now done that, and if anything, my views have strengthened. To put the argument at its most basic, a man can decide to be female, take hormones if required, by whatever sporting organization is concerned, win everything in sight, and perhaps earn a small fortune, and then reverse his decision and go back to making babies if he so desires. It's insane, and it's cheating. I'm happy to address a transgender woman in whatever form she prefers, but I would not be happy to compete against her. It would not be fair." Close quote. Well, and that has cost Martina some public appearances, I'm sure, and it's garnered her a lot of bad tweets. And that's the issue in part that's being discussed at the panel that you mentioned. It is not. It is not a happy argument at all, but an argument that has to do with the fell results of identity politics taken to a, frankly, ridiculous dimension. And a lot of people are passionate about it, but it seems to me that the more fundamental issues have to do with the dead end that identity politics represents. You're watching News from Neptune. There are a lot of things to be talked about. We've been away for a while. You want to take a hand?
Well, it's your turn. It's your turn if you want to.
Our chief researcher, J.B. Nicholson, has pointed out that in the arguments, both domestic and foreign, about everything from identity politics to American assaults on Venezuela, we've actually had very little say about what has been going on in terms of the result of American neoliberal policies at home and abroad. That is, we've not paid any attention to strikes. We've not paid any attention to recent labor history, either domestically, which has been interesting, or foreign. There's been a number of unreported strikes, important ones, not getting much press in the U.S. media. Interesting contradictions to that fact are held out by things as different as the World Socialist website, the rather interesting collection of the blog, really, that the Socialist Equality Party puts together with some people who've done a lot of work on paying attention to these topics, and the Jimmy Dore Show. If you haven't seen the Jimmy Dore Show, it's very interesting. The guy's a stand-up comedian who's gotten interested in politics and talks about it in quite a remarkable way, and I think has redone or has retrieved the reputation of comedians talking about politics, represented by interesting figures like George Carlin in an earlier generation.
Yeah, Mort Saul and people
yeah,
like
exactly.
that. Yeah.
Jimmy Dore is recovering that from a generation of comics, particularly late-night comics, who are slavish supporters of the status quo.
That's you, Trevor Noah.
Well,
and Jon Stewart.
Exactly, and what's his name?
Stephen Colbert.
There we go.
Who had some who sold out, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. They point out that there is one of the major labor actions in the world is going on right now in Mexico. 70,000 Mexican auto workers are on strike, which has not been reported in the U.S. From the end of January in Matamoros, Mexico, on the U.S. border. Dimensions here to the border nonsense that we've been getting from the American administration. On the border in Matamoros, there has been a strike for over a week, for several weeks now, in this area right near the U.S. border that brought production to a standstill, the largest strike on the continent in over 20 years. It was an interesting observation. I really wondered whether that was the case and have not checked it. But the idea that that's true is at least suggested by this account. Workers organized a day without workers and marched to the Texas border, where they chanted, quote, "Gringos, wake up," close quote. Now, I would bet that you had not heard anything about this in relation to the border dispute between the president and his enemies in the U.S. The strike includes a call for all Mexican workers to join them in their class struggle. Clearly a call to unify against capitalist leaders who use Mexican laborers to lower the standards for workers around the world. Mexican workers are standing up against this exploitative system. Now, this suggests that there are further dimensions to this border dispute and this border debate than we have been hearing. Here's a description of it from the Social Equality Party's website. The Matamoros strike is a world event. What is taking place is open class warfare. The corporations are firing hundreds of workers, threatening their families with destitution. Companies are locking workers into the plants, blocking them from walking out with physical barriers. The Mexican Navy and state police are patrolling workers' demonstrations with their fingers on the triggers of their assault rifles. In 1 week, the workers have cost the companies $100 million in lost profits. To date, there has not been a single report in the U.S. media about the strike. The Mexican national media has ignored the strike with almost equal tenacity, while U.S. newspapers like the New York Times waste thousands of inches of column space on questions of sexual and racial identity. They censor the life or death questions facing the working class and black out its struggles. The ruling class, including the trade unions, cannot afford to say one word about the strike in Matamoros because it's terrified that workers everywhere will be inspired by this example, close quote. So notice when you first hear anything about the strike in Matamoros, Jimmy Dore, who I mentioned a moment ago, comment on this as follows. The problem is the unions, he's referring, of course, to North American unions. The unions are corrupted, so the unions get in bed with the companies. They're supposed to be representing the people, but they get bought off by the companies. They don't represent the workers. So the workers are doing this on their own. I think this is right, and it's remarkable that it's being mentioned at all, and shocking that it's not being mentioned more.
Yeah. I guess two questions I would have in regard to that. Of course, the obvious one is, how does this coincide with the ascension of office of Manuel Lopez Obrador? It obviously precedes that, or it even precedes his election last year, but is it being energized because they perceive an opening in his election and taking of office to press a class politics?
I think that's a good question, and I'm not quite sure what the what the answer is. The source that I'm working on here, primarily, as I say, the Socialist Equality Party's WSWS World Socialist website, points out that there is an apparent conjunction between the factory owners and the new, supposedly liberal Mexican administration. And this is talked about by the Socialist Equality Parties in terms of their criticism of another Trotskyist group, the International Socialist Organization, which it points out is covering up for the unions and AMLO, the Mexican president, in its account of the strike. In other words, that the Mexican president is not the innovative figure he purports to be. He's in fact on the side of the unions and the not the striking union members, the official unions and the companies. After nearly a month of silence about this matter, the International Socialist Organization has presented a dishonest account of the ongoing strike of up to 70,000 maquiladora workers in Matamoros, Mexico. The ISO's one and only article on the Matamoros strike was published on February 11th under the title, "The Rising of the Maquiladora Workers." The article frames the wildcat actions as a fight that succeeded in pressuring the corrupt union leaders working on behalf of the companies to defend workers' interests. The article also credits Mexican President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, AMLO, with both the start and the success of the strikes. The ISO is compelled to present an alternative version of events because the truth of what happened in Matamoros is that workers launched a rebellion against the trade unions and the bourgeois movement for national regeneration party that the ISO supports. So there are divisions on the so-called left here, and the strikes are presented as wildcat strikes. The reputation of the new Mexican president as being on the side of workers like this is damaged by this, by his assertion of government and corporate control of these rather widespread industrial actions. So it's something to keep an eye on if you possibly can. As I say, getting any information about this from the from the U.S. media is difficult.
Yeah. And I guess the other issue that why I would question in anything in relation to Mexican politics is it may not directly relate to the drug war, but it seems like everything in Mexico relates to the drug war and how it's
at least that's what we're told.
Yeah, how it's carried out. And I mean, I've been listening to some pretty gruesome accounts of what has gone on with the drug war over many years, and the fundamental corruption of Mexican politics. Not to single out Mexico, but the drug war has brought an element of corruption into Mexican politics, not to mention murder and mayhem and all kinds of things, that it seems like any genuine progress made by AMLO would have to deal with that in some way other than what has been dealt. Somebody came up to me in the past week and said, "Did you hear that AMLO called off the drug war? Like, called it off, like just said, we're having a ceasefire. We're not going to fight it anymore." I haven't found it. I don't know where that's coming from.
A point that our intellectual mentor makes frequently is that if you want to know what's going on in politics, don't read the political pages, the political papers, the New York Times, the Washington Post, etc., but read the financial press. Business people have to know what the situation is. They can't take the platitudes offered by the establishment as news. So if you want to find out what's going on in things like this, the place to go is things like Bloomberg, which for all of its obvious commitments to neoliberal policies, still has to report to its readers what the state of the matter is. Writing on the Mexican strikes, Bloomberg said this week, workers seek pay raise after minimum wage doubled at border. Strikes in Matamoros spread from Maquilas to Arca Continental. That's the headline on Bloomberg. Mexican businessmen ask, the article continues, President Obrador for more order. You know what that means. Because, quote, protesting teachers, striking workers cost billions. And López Obrador says major economic indicators are stable. Alejandro Ramirez, CEO of movie theater chain Cinépolis S.A., said the recent railroad blockades by teachers in the state of Michoacán, you heard that, right, as well as strikes in the border city of Matamoros have cost billions of pesos for different industries and should be dealt with immediately. Quote, thousands of jobs are at stake, he said, adding it's essential for Mexico to keep the investment grade rating for the sovereign to generate investor confidence. In his response, López Obrador said the peso had remained stable during his administration and the stock exchange had gained. The country's main macroeconomic variables have been stable thanks in large part to businessmen who've generated jobs and growth, he said, thanking those present for doing so. Close quote. That's his way of dealing with the strikes. Now, it helps that these things are not reported. I don't know if they're any better reported in Mexico, but I would rather doubt it. Yeah. It certainly is not well reported on this side of the border, for all the talk about the border recently.
Yeah.
You're watching News from Neptune. We're talking about the labor news that you've not much heard. Our researcher, J.B. Nicholson, points out that there's a whole series of European strikes, too, that are not much mentioned, if at all, in the American press. Yeah. Strike action in Belgium and in Germany and in the Netherlands continues with the general nature of these political movements being part of that populist wave that we've been talking about. Yeah. Well, you have to realize that populism arises in response to the neoliberal policies of the U.S. and the EU states that produce austerity. The objections are substantial. They've produced a government in Italy where two populist parties have displaced the Italian equivalent of the Republicans and Democrats. They've produced a remarkable outburst in France where the Yellow Vest protests, which are at base economic, continue, as much as President Macron wants to say that it's a matter of racism. These are all racists demonstrating in their yellow vests, and they have to be suppressed as
not just racist, they're anti-Semites.
Well,
and that's what
came out. The best kind of racism,
Lewis,
right?
Yeah, the epitome of all the whole that consumes all the parts, as
exactly
as Noam Chomsky likes to say, or as some Nuremberg principle likes to say. But Louis Proyek did have a good piece this week on these accusations of anti-Semitism against the Gilets jaunes. And also in the reappearance of a French character named Alain Finkielkraut, who has been notorious over the years for fomenting these charges of anti-Semitism in France.
And the anti-Semitism, I mean, the queen of all the racist charges, anti-Semitism continues to be a remarkably effective, to my utter amazement, charge against the progressive elements in British politics, notably the Labour Party of Jeremy Corbyn. I can't understand how they are willing to fall for such nonsense, except for the fact that it is being trumpeted by the major liberal papers, major liberal outlets, notably The Guardian.
I've got it right here, Carl. I'm on the case.
Preach, David, preach.
New York Times, 7 Labour, meaning British Labour lawmakers resign in UK in rebuke of Jeremy Corbyn, by Stephen Castle, February 18th. Quote, both of the main parties are, is quoting someone from a professor of government at the London School of Economics. Both of the main parties are pulling away from the center ground where traditionally British elections are won, said Tony Travers, the professor. Many, quote, members of parliament in both parties think that the current situation can't go on. They don't think it can remain stable. The question, he added, Travers added, is whether there is a potential correcting mechanism with British politics that means that the broad mass of moderate voters can find that's the key word. The key phrase in terms of what the assumptions are in this article. The broad mass of moderate voters can find a way of voting for moderate members of Parliament to bring politics back from the extreme left and the Brexit hard right. In other words, these 7 members, Labour members, who resigned from the Labour Party ostensibly to oppose Corbyn's anti-Semitism, a non-thing, absolutely a non-thing, have these people concerned because their view of the world is still that there's like 60% moderate, quote unquote, meaning supporting the government policies, and 20% of the extreme on each side, whereas in fact there is 10 or 20%, quote-unquote establishment moderate, and the rest of the 80 or 90% is on the extreme one or the other side.
And together constitute what we've been calling a populist movement, which in Britain won the plebiscite on withdrawal from the European Union. Now, Corbyn and others are being pressed to say, "Oh, now it's time for another vote because we voted wrong the last time. We voted to withdraw, and we really shouldn't." It's an amazing story, complicated and difficult, but misrepresented to an extreme extent. I can't get over it.
Yeah.
But hey, we didn't worry, right, David?
Yeah.
We've
been critical of Richard Seymour, the British leftist, on a recent show in a different context.
Right.
But he did a very good interview, I think, with Chuck Mertz on the This Is Hell podcast.
I didn't hear that.
Or I forget whether it's, well, I'll find it and I'll let JB know about it. But he's done a very good interview talking not so much about the technical issues of Brexit, but really laying out the configuration of the British political parties and the nature of support, good or quote unquote good or bad, quote unquote populist or bordering on racism or whatever, or urban rule by social class, Ireland, England, etc. He lays it all out pretty well. He's quite good about what the British people are, what the UK people are really up to right now.
Well, thank goodness we don't have any problems like that, David. I mean, we have saviors. We have saviors on the horizon, so to speak.
Are we going to have to talk about Bernie Sanders
and AOC?
Yeah. AOC,
I mean, hey, this is
and
identity
Ilhan
politics.
Omar. I can't let this
an old white guy. We need a young POC female.
Yeah, but still, I mean, Ilhan Omar is the real deal in terms of the manner in which she challenged Elliot Abrams.
That's true.
And she's got some stuff going on. And,
that's right.
And I don't disparage it for one second.
But is Bernie the Messiah, or should we look for another?
We don't need a Messiah. We need a movement.
Okay, good. One too many Messiahs.
Yeah. So So I think we'll probably go back and forth about Bernie in the upcoming weeks and months, and certainly. My former friend and your friend Jeffrey Sinclair is clear as to his cynicism regarding the Bernie movement. I am not at all that way for reasons that I couldn't summarize in 1 minute. So,
which is what we have left. Yes.
I'm open to Bernie. We got.
Open to Bernie.
We got 8 minutes. Okay.
Thank
good.
You. Well, that's time enough to slam Bernie, isn't it?
Well, you can have a go at it if you want.
We have some from once again J.B. Nicholson. He talks about what the Jacobin magazine, which we frequently quote here, has been saying about Bernie Sanders, Jeff Nicholson points out that what doesn't turn up much in Sanders' campaign or his supporters' rhetoric is foreign policy, despite the fact that war, along with climate change, is the most important topic the U.S. government concerns itself with, and military spending is the largest expenditure that the U.S. government makes. The Democrats in general can be condemned on these matters, and if you want to see an elegant and accurate and, in fact, devastating condemnation of the Democrats in this regard, look at Glenn Ford's comment on Black Agenda report this week, which I also will place on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. When we come back to the question of Bernie Sanders and foreign policy, we should, of course, take it from the horse's mouth, so to speak. Quote, "At a time when the United States spends more on the military than the next 10 nations combined, and when we're engaged in never-ending wars, ML Martin Luther King's opposition to militarism should be something we learn from. Unfortunately, however, the extent of our huge military budget and our participation in foreign military adventurism remains an issue that few politicians today, Democrats or Republicans, are prepared to discuss. It is my strong view, this is Bernie Sanders, it is my strong view that Dr. King's vision and organizing tactics should continue to guide those of us who want to transform our economic and political systems. Dr. King understood that the only time we bring about real change in this country is when we mobilize people at the grassroots level. 30-second ads may help win some elections, but they're not going to bring about the fundamental changes our country needs. But as Jeff Nicholson points out, that view, that statement, seems to bind Sanders to exactly nothing. He's not promising to reduce how much the U.S. spends on the military, or even mentioning the $21 trillion that seems to have gone unaccounted for in recent years. He's not opposing militarism, as he said King did. He's not offering King's vision and organizing tactics as guidance, as some Democrats offer universal single payer as a goal. Nothing that need inform what we do here and now, but something we need to continue to use as a manipulative tool to get the party faithful to believe we're somehow going in that direction. This seems to me harsh but not inaccurate criticism of what Sanders has done, or rather not done, on foreign policy. The most liberal fringe, if we want to put it that way, of the Democratic Party, Democratic candidates, which would reach as far as Tulsi Gabbard, are notoriously weak on these matters. We don't have an anti-war movement emerging from the supposedly liberal candidates in the Democratic Party. And that's not an accident. The thing to do now, as I say, is go read Glenn Ford's piece on who and what the contemporary Democrats are. And if you're feeling particularly bitter, go read Jeff Sinclair's book about Bernie and the Sandinistas.
Which is already promoting and already being grateful for the fact that Bernie is running so that he can sell more of his books, which is, I understand. He's being a little tongue-in-cheek about that, and that's fine. That's fair enough. I mean, you know, the question is going to come down to whether the enthusiasm that is generated by Bernie Sanders among younger people who are inclined to have by whatever definition, a fairly positive view of socialism, you know, is worth supporting. And I mean, it's clear the Democratic Party, the corporate Democratic Party, is going to relentlessly suppress any challenge to its control over, you know, over its fiefdom, over its role in the American establishment. And insofar as Bernie Sanders does challenge that, even if he doesn't challenge it in every one of his views, he challenges it symbolically in terms of the people who support him, the reasons for supporting him, similar to what perhaps we can say about Donald Trump. And not whatever Donald Trump says, but why did the people vote for him? Why did those people who voted for, you know, who voted twice for, you know, Obama vote for Trump in 2016? Why are these people willing to vote for Bernie Sanders? And the other thing that makes it, you know, the fact that identity politics is used against Bernie Sanders is a point in his favor.
You've been watching News from Neptune for the 8th week of 2019, a Wrong Question edition, as the U.S. political establishment moves to overthrow, by coups, the elected presidents of Venezuela and the U.S., as Presidents Maduro and Trump threaten to inhibit the economic dominance secured by violence of the U.S. 1%. News from Neptune is presented by C.G. Estabrook, David Green, and J.B. Nicholson. It's produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young, with Andrew Scollery. Inshallah, we'll be back next week with a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere in The Tempest, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.